Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm gonna show you the round 3 game from the World Championship between Ding and Gukesh. I have to say this was extremely relevant for my repertoire. But okay, first of all, I was wondering whether Gukesh will repeat 1 to e4, which of course he played in the first game, and also I was wondering whether Ding would play the French against it again, which he used to beat him in the first game. But we get d4. And after knight f6, Gukesh doesn't go for c4, although he has played it before. He plays everything. He plays knight f3. And now Ding transposes to a d4, d5 opening. So c4. And now you could play e6 or c6. He plays e6. And we slowly transpose to the queen's gambit declined. And I'll show you why this is relevant for me. After knight c3, c6, this is a very common position in which queen c2 or bishop g5 can be played. I get this from a different move order. When I play d5 and c4 is played, c6, blah, 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 I play the semi-Slav. One move here for white, instead of e3 or bishop g5 or g3, is to exchange and transpose to the queen's gambit declined. So the variation I get is this one with g6 and bishop e7, where because white hasn't played e3 yet, I can play bishop f5, if that doesn't happen, of course, and challenge this diagonal, which isn't the case in the normal queen's gambit decline exchange. So, in this position, bishop g5 would have been far more common from Gukesh, but he plays queen c2. g6 from Ding, which is okay. You can also play bishop e7, going in for the main lines. This is bishop e7, bishop g5 is tens of thousands of master games. But okay, g6. And in this position, bishop g5 has been played hundreds of times. And the variation goes, of course, you play bishop g5 so that you are in time to play e3 and bishop d3. So after e3, bishop f5, you now have bishop d3. If you don't play bishop g5, then you're going to be forced to play e3, shutting in your bishop. Not only black is able to challenge the b1 h7 diagonal, but your bishop is stuck on c1. So that's the main line. Instead, Gukesh plays h3. And here is why this is interesting for me. As I said, this is my repertoire with black, my tournament repertoire. And I actually know the move h3. It has been played twice by Kramnik, and when I was preparing for a tournament game, I actually looked at those games. He played one game. If you turn on the book on Lichess, you can see the games. One game in which he lost against Nepomniachtchi, and a game before that in which he played Ergaisi a month before that, which he actually managed to draw, but he was losing. And I was analyzing this position maybe a year ago, maybe slightly less. So in any case, h3 is a confusing move that prevents bishop to g4 and prepares g4 in some positions. But it allows bishop f5, and here's the point. After queen b3, your b pawn is attacked, so you have to do something. Queen to b6, now g4, okay? And h3 prevents bishop g4 and is going to chase the bishop away from f5 eventually, and that happens here. So now you have to make a choice. There are two options here. You either take on b3, which is what Ding did in this game, or you play bishop e6. And when I was preparing for that tournament game of mine, even though it was highly unlikely that I was about to face h3, I had decided to play bishop e6. And imagine how excited I was to see the game position today. And really, I was anxious to see what Ding was going to do. He took on b3. And I was wondering, okay, of course, he knows this better than me. This has to be his world championship prep, or at least he had to have had it on the board in the last few weeks or months. And I was wondering why he had decided to go for this. And I'll explain my reasoning for choosing bishop e6. This is the game continuation, ab3, of course. And now you have a choice. You can drop back to e6, which seems sensible to me, or you can play bishop c2. Now, the reason I had discarded queen b3 is because I didn't want to play bishop c2. And this bishop is very, very, very close to being trapped. Here is why. This pawn is hanging, and if this knight comes to d2, then the bishop doesn't really have any squares, because f3 can be played trapping the bishop. So first of all, you want to move this bishop away so that you don't trap it with knight d2. So Gukesh plays bishop f4. And this is still the game Kramnik-Ergaisi, and I'm sure both players knew this. So I'll show you the basic threat. If black does nothing, let's just make a couple of random moves for black. So bishop g7, knight here trapping the bishop here, and rook c1, and the bishop's lost. You can play g5, that's your defensive resource, but that's the best you can get. Okay, that's the best case scenario. You have this idea with g5 to free up the bishop. However, after bishop c2, you constantly have to worry about this. And I'll show you what happened in the Kramnik game. So after bishop f4, h5 was played to challenge this pawn, and of course the threat is to take, where your rook is hanging, so rook g1. Exchanged. And it's at this point that Ding, in a position that has been reached before, thought for 40 minutes. And funnily enough, if I had black here, I would have moved instantly, because I know this position. And it's a crazy coincidence, but I was really happy to see this on the board. I'll show you the problem with what Kramnik played against Ergaisi is. So he took on b3, which is arguably the losing move. The engine gives it as +1 for white, slightly more. Basically, you cannot take. And the point is, I have knight d2, and you have to save your bishop. I take it. You take back, and I go e3. And now I'm threatening to take the pawn. You cannot play b5 because your rook is hanging. So if b5, I can just show you, takes, and bishop g2, and white is winning. There's even a better move here. After b5, I think it's actually correct to throw in g5 or something like that. We can turn on the engine. Yeah, g5 or even bishop g2. But knight b5 is the human way to win. It's just winning. It's plus a million. Basically, the knight cannot be taken. So in that game, that's exactly the position that was reached. Knight d2 was played, bishop c4, dc4, and Kramnik in this position played bishop b4 and somehow managed to draw by pushing his pawns. After e3 he played bishop b4. The best move here is what Ding played, and that's knight bd7. Now, why would you go for this? And this was my reasoning when choosing bishop e6 all the way back before queen takes b3. Because it's very hard to play. The engine says it's equal, and that's fine, but it's the type of equal in which if black makes a mistake, black loses. If white makes a mistake, so what? I mean, black is risking to lose a piece. So Gukesh plays knight d2, trapping the bishop. Now there's no more knight b3. Of course, the same line with bishop b3 would work now, because on bishop g2 your rook isn't in the corner. You can play b5, move the rook to d8 if the same thing happens. And here Ding played a really funny move. Rook g8. I couldn't remember this. At this point I didn't know what had to be done here as black, but this is in fact the best move. And it may be that he was just remembering what needed to be done for those 40 minutes. Now, rook g8 is a funny looking move, but it does a couple of things. First of all, it's preparing to play g5 without losing the pawn. So if you don't do anything as white here, I don't know, let's just make a random move, I don't know, here. Then I go g5, then your bishop has to move, and my bishop has a square. So let's say bishop e3, and I can just play bishop h7 if I have to. Okay, so that's the idea behind rook g8. So Gukesh plays g5. And according to the engine, this is slightly imprecise, although I don't know. The engine thinks rook c1 is best. And of course, here, it says plus 0.1. Of course, white now has to go for that trick of attacking this bishop. So g5, bishop e3, and you drop the bishop back to h7, although bishop e4 is slightly better than bishop h7, but okay, should be roughly equal. Instead, g5 was played. And black is now slightly better, believe it or not. And another thing, after g5, not only does the bishop have the f5 square, but the knight came to h5, which means that this bishop is a tempo gain, which means that this knight can come out to g7 and to f5 if needed. So black's position has improved significantly. Bishop h2 played by Gukesh, and rook h8. Now, rook h8 threatens to, of course, play a discovered attack on the bishop and activates the rook, but maybe he should have considered developing in a different way. I think the engine agrees that this is the best move. If I had black, I'd be trying to move my other pieces. So here, rook h8 is the best move, but there are plenty of good moves. For example, bishop b4. I mean, why is bishop b4 so good? Because if you move this knight, you're not defending b3. Maybe I can trade stuff. Or maybe, okay, I was also wondering about bishop f5, just trying to bring my bishop back, but that seems a bit too risky because of e4. So anyway, rook h8 played. And as I said, he had spent 40 minutes on knight bd7, and at some point he was more than an hour down on the clock. And once again, there's no increment before move 40. This is move 16. So if you get down to a few seconds, then you're going to lose whatever happens. You can have the best position in the world. Gukesh played f3, which is understandable, wants to play e4, wants to trap the bishop. Okay, knight g7. Makes sense. You're attacking the bishop. The bishop saves itself. And if you want, you can pause and try to choose which side you would take. I couldn't decide. When I was watching the stream, I had a board on the side and I was analyzing the positions because David Howell and Jovan Kahuska had the engine on the live board. I didn't want to spoil some of the positions, and I just couldn't figure out who was better here. I decided that I would like to take white, and my conclusion was that black should continue developing, so I was looking at bishop e7. Not only does that develop a piece, but it also threatens to take the g-pawn. Now, I couldn't figure out all the variations. Of course, white's threatening to play e4, and the simplest solution, if you want to avoid your bishop being trapped, is to play bishop e6, bishop f5, bishop e6. And this is sort of something you can do without calculating. Now, when I tried to evaluate this, my conclusion was that white was better because these pawns are great. This knight really isn't going anywhere. This bishop is pretty bad. There's pressure on a7, so your rook is tied down. Maybe I can play b4, b5, a minority attack on the queen side. It all just seemed to be in white's favor. And I didn't know what to do with black after this. So I was looking at bishop e7 and then e4. You can take on g5, of course, that's the point. And after ed5, I didn't know what to do. I had no idea what to do. So I was looking at bishop e3 ideas, and I had just concluded that bishop e7 is bad because white is always better. That's wrong. Bishop e7, the engine says, is the best move. If you turn on the engine here, it says black is better after bishop e7, and bishop f5 is perfectly fine, so is bishop b4. For some reason, I hadn't considered bishop b4. Unfortunately for Ding, I cannot really say blundered here, but he played rook h5. Now, why is rook h5 bad? It's bad because you don't do anything for your bishop, and you're not including your f8 bishop into the game. So you have fewer pieces to fight with. And of course, Gukesh played e4, trapping the bishop. Now, I assumed that white was winning here, and I couldn't figure out a defense. But I, of course, found one later on with the engine. I would have made the same mistake Ding made. He took on e4, and after fe4, knight e6, this is the way he's trying to get his bishop out of harm's way. So after rook c1, he's going to take on d4 defending, and once the bishop attacks the knight, he's going to defend the knight either with bishop g7 or bishop c5. But it all seems very ugly and very loose. That seemed very, very bad. It turns out that on e4, if you don't exchange, if you play knight e6 first, then black is almost fine. Because after rook c1, you still take on d4. And after bishop f2, you don't play bishop g7, you play bishop c5. For some reason, that's better. And I mean, if you turn on the engine, it says plus 0.9, which is much better than the game continuation. I was wondering about knight a4 here, but it doesn't work because apparently you can take on f3, and after knight f3, you can play bishop b4 check, and you're fine. So that's okay. The king moves, you can take either pawn, and you have enough. Let's say bishop takes b3. So you have two bishops, a knight, and two rooks, and you have a bunch of pawns. You have 3 pawns for a knight, and you have these two bishops in the middle of the position. Apparently, the engine thinks this is enough to draw. It would take me 5 hours to understand this one position on my own. So I'm sorry, I didn't have time to do that. But apparently, knight e6 immediately is better. Now, after knight e6, rook c1, here, here, here. So you don't play knight a4. The engine says the best move is bishop d4. And after bishop d4, you have to save the rook, so rook g2. And now bishop c3, bc3, bishop b3, knight b3, d4, fe4 apparently is almost equal. So you're down a bishop for 2 pawns, but after a5, black is supposed to have significant counterplay. Okay, so anyway, after e4, d4 was played. fe4 and now knight e6. And as I said, the idea is if you try to win my bishop, then I'll do that. So when you see this position, you can understand why a human would like to play bishop f5. And no matter what happens, your bishop is safe on e6. White seems to have a better position, but okay, it's okay. So fe4, knight e6, and we get this forced line. The bishop's attacked, knight takes. The bishop's attacked again because white's threatening to take on d4 and take on c2, so bishop g7. Turns out bishop c5 was better once again because the rook's hanging at the end of the line. So if you try knight a4 attacking the bishop, I can now take on b3. And now everything's hanging. This bishop is attacked with check, this rook is hanging, so you have to take here. And after bishop f2, king f2, knight d4, again, you're down a bishop for 2 pawns, but this is supposed to be better because at least you gain the tempo on the rook, and so on and so on. And maybe you can play knight e6 and win this pawn. Maybe. Instead, bishop g7 was played, and this could be, you could say this is losing. The worst part is it's losing and Ding is down on the clock. So at this point he had about 20 minutes, 27 minutes or something like that. And one thing you should always consider when you're down material is, first of all, you want to trade pawns. So we got this endgame, of course, knight e2, once again attacking the knight. Knight takes b3 is the best way to give up a piece. So rook c2. You have to take because you lose the knight, so takes. And king takes. So there's one more trick in this position. Taking with the king is the strongest move. If you take with the rook and I play knight e5, now you have a very, very tough problem to solve. How do you prevent knight f3? If you play rook g3, then I take. And if you take, I go knight f3 anyway. Now it's 3 pawns for a piece, and it's not simple at all. I mean, unless you keep your pawns on the board, you're probably not going to win. So of course Gukesh took with the king. And after knight e5, you still have to deal with this. Once again, rook g3 fails to rook g5. You could play rook c3, but that seems scary. You could play king e3, but again, that seems kind of scary. Your king is loose, you blocked your bishop. Seems scary. So he plays knight d4, solving the problem this way. And of course, if he had taken, c5 isn't possible undermining the knight, so that's good. Okay, so I don't think black should castle queenside. Instead, rook d8 seems better attacking the knight. The knight is pinned, so king e2, avoiding all complications. So let's talk about the endgame conceptually. Black would like to trade everything off. In particular, black would like to trade off a bunch of pawns. Also, there are some piece combinations that would benefit black significantly. First of all, if all the rooks get traded off, it becomes much harder for white to win. If everything gets traded off, let's say we have this position, but it's bishop and knight versus bishop, and Ding is left with the bishop on g7. That's going to be very hard to win, especially because the g5 pawn is not easy to defend. So this should be losing according to the engine, but it isn't hopeless. If you manage to initiate a bunch of trades, especially if you trade pawns, maybe white isn't going to win. So rook h2 by Ding. Everything's pinned. And an excellent move by Gukesh, bishop e2. a6, I mean, saving the pawn. Once the knight moves, the a7 pawn is going to be hanging. b3, doing nothing, preventing knight c4 in some positions. Rook d7, Ding waits. Rook cc1, and this is an astonishing move to me, because the rook isn't really doing anything on c2. And he doesn't want to play necessarily rook d2. He wants the rooks connected, so he plays a rook c1 to play rook d1. And just seems like a very nice consolidating move. At this point, after king e7, Ding had 6 minutes left. This is move 30. So you have 6 minutes to make 10 moves without increment. And that's just very, very tough. Gukesh plays rook cd1. And Ding spent 4.5 minutes almost to just bring the king back to e8. At this point, he had 1 minute and 50 seconds to make 9 moves. So, I mean, you do the math, that's about 13 or 12 seconds per move. You're not going to be making good moves. You can be whoever you want. You're not going to be making good moves. And Gukesh did not rush. He had about 18 minutes. He took his time. He was calm. He didn't... That's a mistake I always make. When my opponent is in time trouble, I tend to move quickly to put pressure on them. That's stupid. You need to play good moves slowly. Let them rush with their seconds on the clock. He didn't rush, of course. He played calmly. He played the best moves. Bishop g3, forking the rook and knight. This move Ding made in a single second, rook h5. So now he had 1 minute and 49 seconds. Knight f3, initiating a bunch of trades. And Ding took. The king took. And I was expecting the bishop to take, or the rook to take on d7, but he took with the king, setting up a trap. And if you initiate a trade of rooks and win the g-pawn, then you either get mated or you lose the rook. There's bishop h4. You move the rook, I play rook d8, checkmate. So an incredible trap. So after king f3, after spending about 40 seconds, Ding played bishop d4. And after rook h1, Ding came down to 9 seconds. So you have, this is move 35. You have 9 seconds for 5 moves. It's physically impossible to move the pieces that quickly. I mean, yeah, so at this point it was clear he was just going to flag or lose. Anyway, he played rook g5. Not that it matters. I mean, he was down to maybe 5 seconds after bishop h3, f5, bishop f4, and here he flagged. So Gukesh equalizes with white. That's good for the match. Even though I love both players, I'm sort of rooting for Ding. I had to choose, so I chose him. But this is good for the match. And before the rest day, if he'd failed to convert such a good position a piece up, I think he would have been devastated, and the match would have been close to over, which is maybe an overreaction to a draw. But psychologically, if you're winning and you mess it up and you're still down in the match and there's a rest day tomorrow and it's brewing in your mind, I think that would have devastated him. So I'm happy for him that he won. Ding probably didn't even expect to survive. He was just down a piece. So again, a variation I play, or I could have gotten in a game, was played in the World Championship. I was happy to see that. See you guys tomorrow. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.